Alright, let's get one thing straight right off the bat. When people talk about ancient civilizations, they usually picture gold, glory, and grand temples reaching up to the sky. And sure, Sumer had some of that. But you know what they don't put on the highlight reel? The bone-dry heat, the crumbling walls, the flies, and the very real, very brutal daily grind of just staying alive in one of the oldest cities on Earth. So buckle up, because today we're going back, way back, to 3000 BC, to the land between two rivers, where humanity basically figured out how to be civilized. And spoiler alert, it was a lot harder than it sounds. You ever walk outside on a summer day and think, man, it is way too hot for this? Well, imagine that. But there's no air conditioning, no cold drink waiting for you in the fridge, no shade except whatever you can find under a palm tree. That was every single day in ancient Sumer. We're talking about southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in a time when the mercury would regularly hit temperatures that would make you want to just lie down and never get up. But these people didn't lie down. They built cities. And not just any cities, the very first cities in human history. Now, doesn't that just blow your mind? Like, stop for a second and really think about that. Before Rome, before Greece, before Egypt had its golden age, there were Sumerians walking around in kilts and sandals, figuring out writing, math, law, and architecture from absolute scratch. We're talking about people who looked at a hot, flat, nearly treeless landscape with two unpredictable rivers and said, yeah, we're going to make something amazing here. That's the kind of hustle that deserves respect. So let's start with where these people actually lived, because it sets the tone for everything. Picture this, a flat, sun-baked plain, stretching out as far as the eye can see. There are no mountains to speak of, no forests, no natural stone formations. The ground is cracked clay and silt deposited over thousands of years by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's flat, it's hot, and resources? Pretty thin on the ground, literally. So what do you build with when you've got no wood, no stone, and no quarry within 100 miles? You use what you've got. And what the Sumerians had was mud. Glorious, stubborn, ancient mud. They mixed it with water and straw, pressed it into molds, and dried it in the sun. And that's how you get a mud brick. And don't you dare underestimate the mud brick, because these things were the backbone of one of the most sophisticated urban cultures the ancient world ever produced. Now, does that sound simple? Sure, but here's the thing. Building an entire city out of sun-dried bricks in a climate that alternates between scorching dry summers and flash flood winters is not exactly a walk in the park. These bricks eroded. They cracked under heat. They turned to mush under rain. Maintaining a mud brick house in ancient Sumer was a never-ending job. You were basically always patching something, always replastering, always watching the walls for signs of damage. Kind of like owning an old car, you know? The moment you fix one thing, something else needs attention. But here's the genius move the Sumerians made. They built upward. Over generations, collapsed and rebuilt structures created artificial hills called tells. Cities literally rose out of the plain on layers of their own history. And sitting on top of these mounds, towering over the flat landscape, were the ziggurats. Those massive stepped temple towers that you've probably seen pictures of. And yeah, we'll get to those. But first, let's talk about what life actually looked like at ground level. So picture a typical morning in a Sumerian city. Let's say Uruk, which was probably the largest city in the world at this point, with somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people packed into its walls. That's not small potatoes, even by modern standards for ancient cities. The sun comes up fast and hard in southern Mesopotamia. By the time you've had your first meal, probably some bread made from emmer wheat and maybe a sip of something fermented because, yeah, they brewed beer and drank it daily, the heat is already building. Hold up, did you catch that? They drank beer. Every day. Men, women, elderly, even children in small amounts. Not because they were party animals, but because it was genuinely safer than drinking water from the river, which could be contaminated. Beer was nutrition. Beer was hydration. Beer was, in a very real sense, survival. So the next time someone gives you grief about having a cold one, just tell them you're honoring an ancient Sumerian tradition. You're welcome. The houses in a city like Uruk were clustered together tightly, sharing walls to keep cool, or at least cooler, during the brutal summer months. A typical home was built around a central courtyard, open to the sky, which served as the main living and working space. You'd cook there, keep your animals there, do your weaving or potting there. The rooms around the courtyard were small and dark, which was actually the point. Dark and thick-walled meant cooler during the day. No windows to speak of, or if there were, they were small and set high in the walls. Doesn't that sound kind of claustrophobic? Imagine spending your whole life in a space like that. Low ceilings, mud walls, no glass, no electric light after dark. Just oil lamps made from clay bowls with a wick floating in animal fat. The smell alone would knock you sideways. Animals, cooking fires, human bodies, the river, decomposing organic matter in the streets. Because yes, ancient Sumerian cities did have drainage systems, but they weren't exactly modern sewage infrastructure. You didn't have to live long in a Sumerian city before you developed a very high tolerance for unpleasant smells. Now here's something that really hits different when you think about it. Social structure. Because Sumer wasn't just a collection of houses, it was a fully organized society, with hierarchies, professions, laws, and an economy that would be recognizable in many ways today. At the top of the pyramid, you had the king and the temple priests. The temple, and we're talking about the great temple complexes, the ziggurats, wasn't just a religious institution. It was basically the government, the bank, and the welfare system all rolled into one. The temple owned land. The temple employed workers. The temple collected grain as a form of taxation and redistributed it to workers, craftsmen, and the poor. It was a redistributive economy, meaning that the temple acted as the central hub through which resources flowed in and back out again. Scribes worked in the temple recording every transaction, and here's where it gets really wild. This is one of the main reasons writing was invented in the first place. Not poetry, not literature, not religious texts. Accounting. The first writing was basically inventory lists and receipts. Can you believe that? The greatest intellectual invention in human history came down to keeping track of goats and grain. Okay, but doesn't that give you a little chuckle? Like somewhere some ancient scribe is sitting there pressing little wedge shapes into a clay tablet at the end of a long hot day, writing down 342 jars of barley received from the eastern fields. And he had absolutely no idea that 5,000 years later, people would be reading about his work in amazement. That guy deserves more credit than he gets, honestly. Below the temple elite, you had a broad middle class of craftsmen. Potters, weavers, metal workers, brewers, bakers, leather workers. These were skilled trades, and they were respected. Then you had farmers, who were the backbone of the entire civilization. And then at the bottom, you had laborers and enslaved people, often prisoners taken in the various wars and conflicts that were becoming increasingly common as city-states competed for resources and power. Speaking of farming, let's get into what was actually on the menu in 3000 BC Sumer, because this is where things get both fascinating and kind of grim. The staple crops were barley and emmer wheat, and they were grown in irrigated fields along the river channels. Sumer's agricultural heartland depended entirely on irrigation. The rivers were life, but they were also unpredictable. Floods came at the wrong time, or not at all. Droughts hit. Salination, the buildup of salt in the soil from years of irrigation, was a slow-moving disaster that would eventually reduce crop yields significantly over the centuries. But in 3000 BC, Sumer was still riding high on its agricultural productivity. So what did people eat? Bread, mostly. Flatbreads and thicker loaves made from barley flour, baked in clay ovens. Porridge, lentils, chickpeas, and onions. Dates. The date palm was incredibly important, providing fruit, fiber for weaving, wood for tools, and even sap for fermentation. Fish from the rivers and the marshes to the south, which were rich with wildlife. Mutton and goat on special occasions. The very wealthy might eat beef, but cattle were expensive and used primarily as draft animals. And here's something you might not expect. The Sumerians were pretty sophisticated cooks. Archaeological evidence and later written records tell us they had dozens of recipes for bread, stews, soups, and roasted meats. They used spices and seasonings. They made cheese. They brewed multiple types of beer and even some wines. This was not just survival eating. There was craft in the kitchen, creativity at the hearth. But, and this is a big but, access to good food was absolutely tied to your social status. If you were a laborer working for the temple, you got a daily ration. And that ration was calculated to keep you alive and working, not to thrill your taste buds. A basic ration worker in Sumer got about 2 pounds of bread per day, a small amount of oil, and a monthly allotment of wool or clothing. That's it. Functional. Bare minimum. It kept you on your feet, but it wasn't what you'd call living large. Now what do you think about that? Does it hit different knowing that the workers who built the first great cities of human history were living on bread rations and river water? Because it should. Every grand structure, every carved stone seal, every cunning little clay tablet was built on the backs of ordinary people living genuinely tough lives. Now let's talk about the heat, because we keep circling back to it, and honestly, we can't overstate it. The climate of southern Mesopotamia in summer is ferocious. Modern temperatures in southern Iraq regularly reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 49 degrees Celsius, in the hottest months. There's very little natural shade. The rivers create some humidity, but mostly what you get is dry, blasting, oven-like heat. How did the Sumerians cope? Thick walls were number one. Mudbrick construction, when done right, has excellent thermal mass. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night, keeping interiors cooler than outside. Courtyards provided airflow, and the Sumerians, like many hot climate civilizations, almost certainly shifted their work schedules seasonally, doing heavy outdoor labor in the early morning and late afternoon, and resting during the worst heat of the day. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's pretty much what every sensible person does in a hot climate to this day. They also wore clothing designed for the heat. Light kilts and wrap skirts made from wool, which might sound counterintuitive, but wool actually insulates against heat as well as cold, and it's naturally breathable. In cooler seasons, they added heavier garments, and when it was really hot, yeah, some people just went without the top half entirely. Practicality over modesty. Water management was critical. The Sumerians dug canals, built reservoirs, and maintained irrigation channels with obsessive attention. Controlling water wasn't just about agriculture, it was about survival of the city itself. And the management of these water systems required coordination, planning, and authority, which is one of the key drivers of why centralized government and hierarchical social structures emerged in Sumer in the first place. The river giveth, and the river taketh away, and you'd better have somebody organized enough to manage both. Okay, let's shift gears a little and talk about something that really pulls you in. The spiritual life of ancient Sumer. Because these people didn't just survive and farm and drink beer and build walls. They had a rich, deeply emotional relationship with the divine, and it shaped everything about how they understood their place in the universe. The Sumerian pantheon was huge, dozens of gods and goddesses, each associated with natural forces, cities, professions, or aspects of human life. Enlil was the god of wind and air, essentially the king of the gods. Enki was the god of wisdom and water, crafty and clever and associated with magic. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was the goddess of love, war, and desire, one of the most powerful and complex figures in the entire ancient Near East. And An was the sky god, the great father figure above them all. These weren't distant, abstract deities. The Sumerians believed their gods were genuinely present, living in the temples on top of the ziggurats, needing to be fed, clothed, and cared for, just like any great noble would. The priests and priestesses weren't just performing rituals for spiritual purposes, they were literally managing the household of a god. They woke the god up in the morning, brought offerings of food and drink, dressed the god's statue, performed music, told stories. It was a full-time job, and it was deeply serious business. And doesn't that tell you something profound about the human need to make meaning? Here are people facing a genuinely difficult existence: blazing heat, flood risk, disease, the constant threat of conflict from neighboring city-states. And what do? They build the most enormous structures their world has ever seen, dedicate them to the divine, and organize their entire society around keeping the gods happy. Because if the gods were happy, maybe, just maybe, the harvest would come in good and the floodwaters would behave themselves. Can you feel the weight of that? An entire civilization's hope and anxiety channeled into those great stepped towers rising against the flat horizon. You know what they say: when life is rough, you hold on to what gives you strength. Now let's not skip over something that often gets glossed over in ancient history discussions: the role of women in Sumerian society. Because it was more complicated, and in some ways more progressive than you might expect from a civilization 5,000 years old, women in Sumer could own property. They could run businesses, particularly in the textile industry, which was massive. Temple workshops employed large numbers of women weavers who produced cloth for trade, tribute, and temple use. Women could testify in legal proceedings. They could divorce, although with fewer rights than men in that process. High-status women, particularly in religious roles, held real power. The priestesses of major temples were among the most respected and influential figures in Sumerian society. Inanna herself, the great goddess, was a figure of fierce independence and power in Sumerian mythology. The myths surrounding her are dramatic, vivid, and complex in ways that go far beyond simple nature symbolism. There's a reason she resonated so deeply with people for thousands of years across dozens of cultures. She represented something real and essential about human experience. Now, was ancient Sumer a paradise of gender equality? Absolutely not. Women's lives were constrained in significant ways, and the legal and social system clearly privileged men. But relative to what came later in many other ancient cultures, Sumerian women had a degree of agency and legal personhood that's worth acknowledging. And speaking of things worth acknowledging, literacy. Not everyone was literate in ancient Sumer, but the existence of a scribal class meant that knowledge was being recorded and transmitted in ways it simply wasn't in pre-literate societies. Young men, and some women, trained as scribes in institutions called edubba, or tablet houses. This was serious, rigorous education focused on mastering the complex cuneiform writing system. And we know something about what this education looked like, because Sumerian students wrote complaint tablets about it. Literally, there are ancient clay tablets where students basically wrote the equivalent of, "This class is hard, and my teacher is tough, and my homework is endless." Some things, as they say, never change. Let's zoom in now on the physical experience of just moving through a Sumerian city, because it's something the textbooks kind of skip over, and it's genuinely fascinating when you picture it. The streets of a city like Uruk were narrow and winding, unpaved, and in the rainy season turned to mud. There was no urban planning in the modern sense. Buildings grew organically, and streets formed in the gaps between them. Stalls and workshops opened directly onto the street. You'd walk past a metalworker hammering copper tools, a baker pulling flatbreads from an oven, a weaver working at a loom in the doorway for light, a merchant displaying clay pots and bags of spice. The noise alone would have been overwhelming. Animals everywhere, donkeys, goats, dogs, cattle being herded through the streets. People calling out, arguing, laughing, chanting prayers. The creak of wooden cart wheels on uneven ground, the slap of sandals on packed earth. And underneath all of it, the constant low-level hum of a city that never really went quiet. Because here's the thing about ancient cities that we forget in our modern, insulated, climate-controlled lives. They were intensely communal. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Walls were thin. Courtyards were shared in some cases. Your neighbors knew your business, and you knew theirs. There was no retreating into a private screen, no putting on headphones and zoning out. Life in a Sumerian city was raw, immediate, and deeply social in ways that are honestly kind of hard for modern people to fully imagine. And yet, and this is the part that really gets you, within all that noise and heat and crowding, people were writing poetry. They were composing hymns to their gods. They were debating legal cases. They were recording stories that would become the first great literary tradition in human history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving piece of epic literature, traces its roots back to this time and this place. Gilgamesh himself was, according to Sumerian records, a real king of Uruk around this very period. Think about that for a second. A real person, sweating in the same brutal sun, walking the same muddy streets, looking out over the same flat horizon, and somehow his story survived 5,000 years to reach us. If that doesn't give you goosebumps, I honestly don't know what will. Now here's a piece of daily life in ancient Sumer that tends to get a bit glossed over: medicine and health. And let's be real, this is one area where being alive in 3000 BC was genuinely rough. Average life expectancy in ancient Mesopotamia was low by modern standards, probably somewhere in the range of 25 to 35 years at birth, though that number is pulled down heavily by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you had a decent shot at making it to your 50s or even 60s. But surviving childhood was no small thing. Diseases that we treat routinely today, infections, gastrointestinal illness, malaria and other vector-borne diseases, respiratory infections, parasitic infections from river water, were major killers. Medical practice in Sumer was a fascinating blend of genuinely practical observation and spiritual intervention. There were Harzite physicians who treated physical ailments with herbal remedies, dietary guidance, and practical procedures. And there were Ushapu, healing priests who addressed illness through ritual, prayer, and the expulsion of evil spirits. The Sumerians believed that illness was often caused by divine displeasure or demonic interference. So a good treatment plan might involve both giving someone a plant-based remedy for their fever and also performing a ritual to appease whatever spiritual force was causing the problem. Is that superstition? Sure. But it's also worth noting that some of the herbal preparations Sumerian physicians used have been shown to have genuine medicinal properties. These were not ignorant people. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge available to them, and they were observing, recording, and building a body of medical knowledge that influenced later cultures for centuries. Now, doesn't that put things in perspective? We throw around the phrase ancient wisdom a lot, sometimes sarcastically. But there's something real there. People who figured out through pure observation over generations which plants reduce fever, which ones help with pain, which ones treat infections. That's knowledge earned the hard way. Respect where respect is due. Let's talk trade for a minute, because one of the most underrated things about ancient Sumer is how connected it was to the rest of the ancient world. These weren't isolated communities stumbling around in the dark. They were active participants in long-distance trade networks that stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to Egypt and the Mediterranean in the west. Sumer was resource-poor in many ways. No metal, no stone, limited timber. So to get what they needed, they traded what they had. Agricultural surplus, especially grain, and manufactured goods, especially textiles. Sumerian cloth, made in those great temple workshops, was traded far and wide. and in exchange came copper and tin from the mountains to the north and east, cedar wood from Lebanon, carnelian and lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan, silver from Anatolia. Lapis lazuli, that deep, vivid blue stone, was particularly prized in ancient Sumer. It appears in jewelry, in decorative art, in temple offerings, and the fact that it came from sources thousands of miles away tells you something remarkable about the trading networks that existed even 5,000 years ago. The ancient world was not as isolated as we sometimes imagine. People were moving, trading, communicating, and sharing ideas across huge distances. The boats on the Tigris and Euphrates were the highways of the ancient world. Reed boats, wooden cargo vessels, and reed rafts moved grain, pottery, animals, and people up and down the river system. Donkey caravans crossed the deserts and mountains connecting Sumer to its trading partners. Merchants, a respected profession in Sumerian society, negotiated deals, took loans, managed risk, and kept the whole system running. And here's one of those details that just makes ancient history come alive. We have actual records of Sumerian business transactions, bills of sale, loan agreements, partnership contracts, real estate deeds. Because once you've invented writing for accounting purposes, you might as well use it to protect your commercial interests. The first lawyers in history were probably arguing over clay tablets in Sumerian courtrooms. Wild, right? All right, let's bring it home with something big. Why does any of this matter? Why should you, sitting here in the 21st century, care about a bunch of people who lived in mud-brick houses and sweated through their kilts 5,000 years ago? Here's the honest answer. Because they are the foundation of almost everything you take for granted. Writing, cities, codified law, agricultural surplus that allows for specialized labor, centralized administration, long-distance trade, epic literature, mathematical notation, astronomical observation, the division of the day into 24 hours and the hour into 60 minutes, that comes from Mesopotamia. The concept of a 7-day week, Mesopotamia. The very idea that human beings can organize themselves into large, complex, cooperative societies and build something greater than any individual, that was figured out, in large part, right here, in the burning heat between two rivers. The Sumerians didn't see themselves as inventing civilization. They were just solving problems. How do you manage water in an unpredictable landscape? How do you coordinate labor on a large scale? How do you record who owns what and who owes whom? How do you pass on knowledge to the next generation? How do you make sense of a universe that seems capricious and dangerous and beautiful all at once? And in answering those questions, in their imperfect, inventive, sweaty, beer-drinking, clay tablet-writing way, they built the bedrock on which every civilization since has rested. That's not an exaggeration. That's the plain, remarkable truth. So next time the heat hits hard and you feel like everything is too much, think about a Sumerian farmer standing in a field at the edge of an irrigation canal, watching the sun hammer down on the flat plain, and knowing that tomorrow he'll be back out there doing it again. Think about the scribe bent over a clay tablet, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay before it dries, recording something that will outlast his civilization by millennia. Think about the woman in the temple workshop running her hands through freshly spun thread, counting, measuring, keeping the whole operation running with precision and care. These were real people. Complicated, creative, stubborn, brilliant, ordinary, extraordinary people, living in mud-brick houses in burning heat, building something the world had never seen before. And honestly, you have to hand it to them. They pulled it off. Thanks for riding along on this journey back to 3000 BC. If this kind of deep dive into the raw, unvarnished reality of ancient life is your thing, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and stick around, because we've got a whole lot more history to dig up. And remember, the story of humanity is wild from the very beginning. You just have to know where to look.